One day I got a phone call from Ottawa, and it was a person that said, "Will you be in your office tomorrow morning between 10 and 11 o'clock Vancouver time?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" And she said, "Well, the Minister of Justice is going to phone you." I said, "Oh." So I was in my office the next morning, and at 10:30 I got a call from the Minister of Justice who said, "Would you accept an appointment to the Supreme Court?"
That's Paul Williamson, and this is The Stories That Brought You Here, a podcast dedicated to learning about the lives of the people living in and around the Salish Sea. I'm your host, Chris Wakaluk. Well, as we go through life, it seems as if we have a lot of different paths that we wind up taking that bring us to becoming the person that we are. And Paul Williamson has taken many different paths, from being a logger to a newspaper reporter, teacher, a lawyer, and ultimately a Supreme Court judge of British Columbia. Paul has had a lot of careers and a lot of different experiences in his life that he's going to share with us today on this podcast. We spend a lot of time talking about the many years he spent working within the legal system as a lawyer and also as a judge. And for me, this was incredibly informative because I had an opportunity to speak to somebody who is a retired judge and ask all sorts of questions that I had about the legal system. And Paul is an incredibly intelligent, humorous, and pretty fantastic individual that had some really insightful and great answers. So that's coming up in a few minutes. But before we get started, there's a story that I'd like to share with you. And that is about my mom. So in January of this year, I went to Burnaby to record my mom's audio memoir. She recently turned 83 and her health is quite well, but I knew it was time to ask her to record her life stories. In my family, there's a lot of family photos that go quite a ways back, but there's not a lot of written documentation and certainly no audio documentation of people's lives. So my mom graciously said yes to doing this, and we spent about 8 hours talking on the phone over multiple days in early January. And then in the third week of January, I went over there for 3 days, and we recorded for about 11 hours. During these conversations, I learned so much about my mom. I found out a lot about my maternal family history that for her began in Manitoba, and also about the pre-immigration history of her grandparents and their time coming over from the Ukraine. In these recordings, my mom shared stories about being a young teenager and playing piano and basketball. She elaborated on the story of how she met my dad, talked about their early life together before they had children, spoke about the ups and downs about being business owners and making a young family and a relationship work during those times in the 80s. And it is difficult to overstate just how fantastic this is that I have this. Now, I've done about a dozen audio memoirs for people in the past, and I'm really happy I encouraged my mom to do one, and I'm so happy she said yes. So moving forward, once I finish editing all the recordings, I'll have a delightful keepsake for myself and other family members to have about my mom and her life. If you are at all interested in having your own story documented on audio for your own personal memoir, or you have any questions about the process, you can reach me at myaudiomemoir@outlook.com. That's all one word, myaudiomemoir@outlook.com. There's a link for that in the show notes. You can just click on that, and I can let you know about all the steps involved in creating a wonderful keepsake for your own family to have. My audio memoir. Let your stories be your legacy. And now it's time for my interview with Paul Williamson.
So you want to know how it was I ended up embracing law and becoming involved in law?
Yeah.
It was a long pathway for me because My parents didn't graduate from high school, and their goal was that their 5 children would all get to grade 12, and we did. But when I got to grade 12, it never occurred to me to go any further. So I went off and I had a few jobs, working in logging camps and working in a beatnik coffee bar and various things. This was in the 50s when I started. And but after I'd been in the logging camps for a couple of years, 2 friends that had been in high school with me said, "Paul, we're going to go to Europe for the winter. We're taking a year off university. Come with us." I was working in a logging camp up on Nootka Island on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So I said, sure, and off I went. Spent the winter traveling around Europe, staying in youth hostels until I ran out of money. Got a job for about 3 months in Munich, being a grease monkey. And then I came home and I contacted my younger brother, 2 years younger than I, who was working on the railroad, repairing railway tracks. And I said, I just been in Europe for months, staying in youth hostels, and they were all university students. I was the only one that wasn't. And they didn't seem all that smarter than us, so why don't we go to university? And he said, okay. And off the 2 of us went to UVic. We started together. And I got my degree, my BA, and while I was there, I started stringing for a newspaper. When I graduated, I got a job as a newspaper reporter in then the Victoria Times, when the Times and Colonist were separate newspapers. And I was there a couple of years, and I decided that what I really wanted to do was teach. So I left and I went to Carleton, got an MA, and I got a job teaching in a college in, of all places, Quebec City. Alors, j'ai enseigné pour 2 années. I taught for 2 years in Quebec City. And then I decided that wasn't really for me. And I decided I wanted to be self-employed. And I thought, what could I do where I don't have a boss, where I can be self-employed? And I thought, I can become a lawyer. Came back out to Vancouver, went to UBC Law. 3 years after, you get a 3-year course, I graduated, and then I did a thing that changed my legal career. You can be a law clerk to a judge for a year after you graduate from law school, but before you article and be called to the bar. And I did that for a wonderful man on the BC Court of Appeal. His name was Peter Seaton. I spent an amazing year with him, learning everything that what a judge needs to hear to help him make a decision and why he makes a decision a certain way. He became a lifelong friend. After I finished that year, I articled with a wonderful lawyer. And at the end of that, when I was called to the bar, I got 2 of my colleagues from my law school class. We were all the same year. We rented offices in Gastown and Vancouver and started our own law firm. We were our own bosses. And we had a wonderful time. The lawyer to whom I had been articled was helpful to us and mentored us. The judge to whom I had clerked was helpful to us and mentored us. And I started right then, going to court almost every day, in provincial court in those days with minor crimes. This was on the provincial court on Main Street in Vancouver. And I just learned as I went along, and I got help from my friends who were both top of the law class. One of them, there were 3 of us, 2 of us became judges. The other one became one of the authorities on Indigenous law in BC. He taught for over 30 years at the UVic Law School. So we were a very successful trio from that little law firm that started out from zero. It was a wonderful way to learn because we had to do everything ourselves and consult with one another and consult with some of those older lawyers and a couple of the judges that helped us. The other thing I'd say is that after 7 or 8 years, I started being asked to be commission counsel on a number of commissions of inquiry, and that was because of my connection to the court when I spent that year as a law clerk. And what happens, some incident happens in BC. I'll give you an example. You may not remember this, but around 1990, a BC ferry pulled out of the Nanaimo Harbor and the ramp was still down. It hadn't lifted, and there was a truck on the ramp. And when the ferry pulled out, the truck went down, bounced off the back of the ferry into the water. Unfortunately, some people were killed. There was immediately a commission of inquiry, and a judge, who was the retired Chief Justice of BC, phoned me to be commission counsel. So what a commission counsel does is decides who's going to give evidence. You interview everybody, you call the evidence. When it's over, and you question the witnesses and so forth. And when it's all over, you help the commissioner write the report. And I did a number of those, and they were fascinating. Most of those commissioners were judges, and so I built up a strong connection with the judiciary in BC. And that's what sort of introduced me to that world.
Well, there's so many different avenues we can go here, and I feel like maybe it might be a disservice to skip over the earlier parts of your life. But I just want to touch back in to the logging for starters, actually,
Sure.
right? So, how old were you when you first began logging?
I guess I was 19, and I worked as a scaler, a wood scaler. And what a scaler did in those days is the fallers, they would fall the timber. And depending on what type of a tree it was, a cedar or a fir, they bucked it a certain length that was predetermined and they were told to buck it. And then the wood scaler who went into the woods and calculated the board feet in those lumbers. You had a scale stick thing. It was about 6 feet long. You walked along the log, tapping it with the stick, figuring out how long it was, and then you measured the diameter on the stick. It had the calculation for this diameter, this length. You wrote that down. In those days, that's how many board feet it was. In those days, that's how fallers were paid. They got paid by the number of board feet they fell each day.
Wow, okay.
And so scalers generally had 4 different fallers, and you went among the woods to the 4 fallers. The danger was that they were always falling trees, and they didn't know when you were coming and which direction you were coming from. I had a couple of unfortunate close calls. The funniest thing that happened to me is that I was walking along a felled tree, and I'm measuring the length of it, and suddenly my stick went down and hit, what was it? A wasp nest that was in the tree, of course, but by then it was lying on the ground, and the wasps came out and swarmed me, and I ran down to the end of the log, which was sticking out over the ocean, and I jumped into the ocean, and I swam underwater. When I came up, they were waiting for me, and I got a dozen stings on the top of my head.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was unpleasant, but there was something amusing about it all. As for an injury in the woods, that's not bad. Incidentally, that way of paying fallers was eventually made illegal because they tended to what we called highball. They would go like crazy because the more trees they fell, the more they got paid, and they made mistakes. And I saw a couple of terrible accidents where fallers injured themselves because they were being careless. They were going way too fast. And that was outlawed long after I was there, but a decade or so later.
Yeah. Well, how did you enjoy that experience of working in the woods?
Well, I liked it. There were drawbacks to it. We were in float camps we lived in bunkhouses that were on rafts, and then one of the bunkhouses was the dining room. And we would log a certain area, and then they would just tow the rafts down Tassus Inlet to another area. But when you're 19, 20, there wasn't a girl my age in the neighborhood. And, I admit that I had thoughts of wanting to meet a young woman.
Yeah, a lot of men hanging out in those areas. Yeah,
absolutely.
And so, how long did you do that for?
I think I did it almost 2 years, probably about 20 months, and that's when my friends convinced me to go to Europe with them.
Okay, so you go to Europe, and then you have this revelation that things could be different in your life from experiences you had there. What were some of the pivotal experiences that happened while you're in Europe, would you say?
Well, I think the main thing was staying in youth hostels with all these university students from over the world. You'd stay in three or 4 nights in this town, and then you'd go on to the next one. But you were always in youth hostels. And you'd get into conversations, and we discussed about the country we were visiting. We talked about politics. We talked about the events that were going on in the world. And I found that I didn't have a lot of trouble discussing with them. None of them said to me, "Oh, you're uneducated," you know. And I just add that one of the things that happened to me in the logging camp was that one of my grandmothers, she was the only one in the family that thought I should go to university. She kept sending me interesting articles, and she would send me magazines like the BBC Listener and the New Yorker magazine. And that got me reading and thinking about things, because there was nothing to do at night in the logging camp except read. Most of my colleagues in the logging camps were reading Playboy, but I was reading these things, and it started me thinking. And then when I got into all these discussions with university students, I thought, I could equal these guys. I could do what they're doing.
Yeah, people go on these European adventures, or they spend time overseas, and it seems like people come back changed. And this change for you was it's time to go into higher education that you didn't think that you were going to do before.
Never thought of it until then. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that once you went through school, you became a newspaper reporter.
I did.
So could you walk us through a little bit about what that experience was like?
Well, it was very interesting, and I think it was different than the world of reporting is today. For one thing, newspapers proliferated the country, and now there are very few. So it was a large profession. The other thing is that I got assigned to the police beat, and I covered the police in Victoria and the provincial court in Victoria, which is my first experience in a courtroom. So every day, I would be in touch with the police, and I would hear about an incident somewhere, and I would go there. And what I remember was different about it is I had about a 58 Volkswagen Beetle, and in the front window, there was a sign that said press. And when I would arrive at a police incident that was cordoned off, with a yellow ribbon, the police would see me, and they would open the ribbon and get me to come in. That doesn't happen today. So there was a different relationship then between the press and the police. Now, there were a few policemen that I didn't like and I thought were unpleasant people who were rather mean and rude to people, but a lot of them were wonderful, and they were helpful to me, and I would ask them stuff and they would tell me, and it would make it easier for me to write a story about the incident. The other thing was, of course, I went to court 2 or 3 mornings a week to the provincial court. And one of the things was, that was in the late 60s. I remember every time I went to court, there was 5 or 6 young people charged with possession of marijuana. They were either convicted or pleaded guilty, and they were sentenced to jail for 3 months, sometimes 4 months, sometimes 5 months, for possession of a few joints of marijuana. And the one thing I learned in that experience was how ridiculous our drug laws are. It's nuts. And I predict that 30 years from now, we will have abolished all these drug laws and we'll be scratching our head. And instead of spending hundreds of millions of tax dollars on police and prosecutors and courts and prisons and prison guards, we'll spend that money rehabilitating drug users, helping them, putting them in centers where we treat them instead of jailing them.
Sounds like a wise idea. And it does seem like that's the direction that things are going. And it is amazing to think that there was the reality not too long ago. Yeah. And in the States, even more recently.
Absolutely.
And
that ruined those people's lives. They had a criminal record.
Yeah. Just for a little bit of pot. Come on. Well, I'm kind of curious about the storytelling aspect of being a reporter and what that was like. So I would imagine things have changed a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit, in the world of newspaper reporting. Yeah. Probably quite a lot at this point. But when you were doing it, what was your guiding philosophy in terms of how to tell a story about an incident?
My guiding philosophy was to try to enjoy it. And I'll tell you that in those days, there was a big newsroom. There were probably 30 reporters there. And there were about 4 guys on what was called the desk. By the way, they were all men. There were a few female reporters, but in those days, they only reported on child stories or fashion stories. And that always bugged me then. I thought that was weird. But I'll just give you an example. There was a high school in Campbell River in the late 60s that became very famous because the principal became very progressive, and he dropped all the rules. And if you were an A student, you didn't have to go to every class. You could go to the library, you could go to meetings, and you could do things. And all the rigid rules. Like I went to high school in Victoria, Vic High School. If you go there today and look at that building, you'll still see on one side of it, it says boys entrance. On the other side, it says girls entrance.
No way.
Yeah. And all of that stopped. When the editors of the Victoria paper found out about that, they said, Paul, go up and spend a couple of days at that. Interview the students, interview the principal. And I did, and it was fun. And I wrote a 6 or 7 part article about it. And what I remember is when I turned it in to the desk in Victoria, they loved it. And they said, Paul, go back to your own high school and write an 8th section of this article comparing them. And I went back and I got to say all these rigid, silly things. One of the things I remember about the high school is when I was there, a new principal came in. I'm not going to mention his name, but we all knew him by his name. But when he became principal, he changed and he put an initial because he went by his second name, as I do. My name is Lloyd Paul Williamson. I go by Paul. He did that. But he put that initial in front and made him look important. I just, it was just such a rigid place and strict rules about everything. None of that in the Campbell River High School. The kind of freedom that I think exists in many schools today. There's much less of these rigid rules. So I did things like that, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah. So when you were, right, you said your guiding philosophy was fun, which is a great way to go about doing work, thinking of it as fun instead of a job. But did you gain a lot of satisfaction out of doing that work?
Yeah, I did. But I eventually concluded that wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life because I was always doing it at the direction of others. It was the editors who said, Paul, we want you to write a story about this. You want me to write a story about it? Occasionally I'd say, well, gee, I want to write a story about this. And if I did that, usually they'd say yes, but sometimes they'd say, well, maybe, but right now we got to cover this. We want you to do that. And the other thing is I found there was a kind of a seniority in the newsroom, and the senior reporters got all the really fascinating stories. And it took years to get there, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do other things. And I thought teaching at the post-secondary level would be, because I'd enjoyed being a student, and I had 2 or 3 profs that I really liked. And I thought, if I can go away and become a college or university teacher, I'll really enjoy it. And so that's what I set out to do.
Okay, so you set out to do it and you accomplish it, and then you wind up going to Quebec.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how did that come to fruition?
When I was an undergraduate student at UVic, I ended up as president of the Students' Council, and I became a member of the board of governors of what was then called the National Federation of Canadian University Students. And during my 4 years as an undergraduate, I took a year off to go to Ottawa to lobby Parliament with the guy who was then president of NIFGUS, the National Federation. We had an office in Ottawa, and our job was to get politicians to pass the Canada Student Loan Bill. There was no Canada Student Loan Bill then.
Okay, and sorry, what is that?
Well, that's when you go to university, you can get a loan. It's under the Canada Student Loan Act. That's to enable you to go to university.
Okay, all right.
And there was no such thing then. And that was a federal law that was passed at the end of that year. I spent a year in Ottawa lobbying, and I got to know quite a few interesting politicians, which was really fascinating for me. And being on the executive committee of the National Federation, there were a number of Quebec students on there. And I, being a boy born and raised on a beach in British Columbia, I never had any connection with Quebec, and suddenly here was these people. They were fascinating, and they were bilingual, which made me jealous. And a couple of them said to me, Paul, I got to like them. We became friends. And they said, why don't you come and teach in Quebec? And so eventually one of them said to me, Paul, there's a position at this college in Quebec City. Apply for it. So I did, and I got the job.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that it was very interesting to engage with politicians you found.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, we all have a pretty dim view of politicians, or at least I do.
Yeah, I think most of us do.
Yeah. And, but I met some politicians there that were really like Pauline Jewett was one of the people who helped us. She was a member from somewhere here in British Columbia. She eventually ended up the president of SFU. But she helped us and introduced us to various politicians who she thought would listen to us and would help us and tell us who to talk to. And that sort of networking began. And I found that really fascinating to see kind of how they worked. And we did it. We got to know some politicians in 3 different political parties. And the ones that we became friends with, we really quite liked. And I hadn't felt that way about politicians before. So that was a good side of it.
Yeah, it is interesting. So you get to see the inner workings of what's going on.
Absolutely.
And so did anything kind of surprise you about that? Or
I guess I was surprised that the ones that really sort of cottoned onto us and helped us. I didn't expect that. I thought it would be very hard to get to see people and speak to them. But we had these 2 or 3 people that helped us and said, they would say, oh, I talked to, so-and-so from represents a riding in Manitoba or in Nova Scotia or something. And I told them about what you guys are saying. And they said, yeah, they'd like to talk to us. And so that we would go there and they would listen to us. And then they would put us on to somebody else. So that kind of was like networking.
Yeah.
And I hadn't expected, I don't know what I expected when I went there. It was just learn as you go.
So indirectly from that experience, you wind up teaching in Quebec due to some interactions that you had with other individuals there. And so what part of Quebec were you in?
Quebec City.
Quebec City. Beautiful Quebec City.
Beautiful Quebec City.
Yeah. So moving out from the West Coast and then going to Quebec City. And what year are we at roughly right now?
I taught there from 1969 to 1971.
Okay. All right. And so I'm not totally familiar with the history of Quebec and what's going on during that time, but was it a tumultuous time in Quebec? Were things pretty calm? And actually this is 69, 70, 71. Things were going on in the world.
They were.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. There was lots of argument between Quebec and Ottawa and moving towards a special status for Quebec and expanding the French language. All of that was going on. And I found that really fascinating. I really enjoyed it. There were things I didn't enjoy about Quebec, but I liked that. I really did. And I liked that it was a beautiful city. And everywhere I went, I was well treated and welcomed, and my colleagues were great. Took me everywhere to pubs and bars and parties and events. It was great.
It sounds like it was kind of a welcoming place.
It was to me anyway. I think there was some antipathy towards Anglais, towards English-speaking Canadians. But I think there was a recognition that I was there. I wanted to understand Quebec and try and learn about it. And I think that I somehow got that across, and people helped me to do that.
And what were you teaching?
I was teaching in a program called Canadian Studies. So it was a combination of Canadian history, Canadian politics, English, Canadian, French, Canadian relations, and so forth. So it was all very current, and it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Nice. Well, what made it fun? What made it enjoyable?
The students and my colleagues. And also my friends that I had met when I was on the National Federation of Canadian University Students, a number of them were from Quebec. And when I went there, those friendships, they were so helpful to me, and they were all successful people moving into professional careers outside of the university. So I had this connection in and out. And a lot of the students I really liked. Some of them I still hear from, 50 years later.
Oh, really?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
One of them in particular, interesting guy, and became an actor. And I've kept some connection. And I've certainly stayed connected with a couple of people that I taught with or who were on that National Federation with me.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm picking up a through line here of interaction with people. It seems like, tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you really like people.
I do. I do. I very much. I really that was one of the things I loved about post-secondary teaching, because I was teaching people that were generally 18, 19, 20. And the hardest thing for me was learning their names. And I used to, the first class of each year, for each class, I would pass around a class list and I would say, write something opposite your name that would make me remember you or recognize you. Well, I got some fascinating comments. And my favorite one was this one beautiful young 19-year-old woman writes, I'm in love. And I thought, oh my God. And a couple of days later, she came up to me at the end of the class to ask me something. And I said, I wanted to know, why did you say I'm in love? And she said, because I'm getting married next weekend.
Oh, I see what you mean now.
Yeah. Oh, phooey.
I assumed you meant something else.
Yeah. So I really liked the students. And they liked me because I was not their normal Quebec raised teacher, that I was from another part of the country, and I had and they would talk to me about that. What is it like? What's it like in British Columbia? They would want to know. So that worked well.
Yeah. Well, I just out of curiosity, what would you tell them? What was it like in British Columbia? What would you say?
Well, I told them about my life and that I had always lived within 2 blocks of the ocean. And one of the things I was uncomfortable in Quebec City was I was only 2 blocks from a river. I told them about the beauty of the forests. I told them how I had spent so much of my childhood on boats, and I missed that when I was in Quebec City. I tried to make it sound as welcoming as I could so that they would go there, because to my mind, the more Quebecois who came and spent some time in British Columbia or somewhere else, the more they became Canadian.
Right.
And I would say that the same. I mean, friends of mine from BC who have gone and lived in Quebec for a while, they've got a stronger sense of Canada and what it is. And to me, that's good.
Yeah, totally. My wife and I lived in Montreal for 6 months one winter, and there's nothing like spending a significant amount of time somewhere. Because just if you are in a city or a country for a few days, you don't really get a grasp of it. But 6 months, I got a little bit of an understanding as to what was going on in Quebec, more than I would have had I not gone there.
Sure.
And it's a beautiful place. Beautiful place.
And you'd even had that experience is even stronger in Quebec because the lack of the English presence that's in Montreal.
Sure, yeah. Definitely. I felt kind of surrounded by Anglophones, and I've heard that doesn't exist outside of pockets in Montreal. So you come to the end of your time teaching, and then you come to the realization that
I wanted to be self-employed.
Self-employed. So this is how you get into law, because you want to be self-employed.
Yeah.
You're tired of being told what to do.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, so maybe walk us through the steps.
Well, I thought about it in the second year that I was there. I mean, I was enjoying it. There were many things I liked about it, but I felt constrained always, as I had felt when I had been a reporter, that people were telling me what to do. And I wanted to be my own boss. I'm not sure why I felt that, but I recognized that I felt it. And I thought about it, and then it hit me that if I became a lawyer, I could just open my own office. And of course, because I had spent time in a court when I was a newspaper reporter, I had seen lawyers. And I started to think about that. And I thought, wow, that looked, I think I'd like to do that. And that was something I could do and not be bossed around.
Okay, well, this is interesting because this is from a previous conversation we had. From my understanding, this really kind of shaped your life in a really large way. But the idea of being your own boss, because you could have opened up your own store, you could have done, like any number of things. But was it what you just mentioned earlier about the experience about being in the courtrooms and at the courthouse?
I think it's a combination. I would say it was a combination of spending a lot of time in a courtroom watching lawyers. It was spending a lot of time writing about things, that is, expressing myself as a reporter, and a lot of time expressing myself and talking, teaching. And that I wanted to be able to bring my ideas and my thoughts to form part of what I was doing, rather than being so governed. That's not to say there aren't rules in a courtroom, and there are, but there's a lot of leeway, and it's always very good if you bring a fresh approach to something. And I thought that I could do that as a lawyer, and that's why I eventually decided that's what I wanted to do.
Okay. So you mentioned when we first started that you went to law school. Maybe if you could explain a little bit about how law school was for you, like how was that experience being in law school?
It was great. I made some very, very good friends. With 2 or 3, I had 5 profs each year, each of the 3 years. A couple of them I had twice. They taught me in 2 different years. A couple of them I became very close friends. They were my age. I was one of the older law students because I was 31 when I went to law school. Most of the law students were 21, 22. So that sort of changed my relationship with the profs. And I'd been a teacher. And they eventually soon quickly ascertained that about me, and I became friends with some of them. So it was a very good experience. Yeah.
So you mentioned 3 years.
Yeah, 3 years to get a law degree. Yeah.
3 years is a significant chunk of time.
Well, then by then I was 34. I was getting on.
And so when you did complete this 3 years, you mentioned that you opened up a firm with 2 other gentlemen?
Well, no, I first spent a year what was called clerking for a judge.
Right.
And I'll tell you, that's interesting because it was a friend of mine who was 1 year ahead of me in law school, and she did it. And it was the first year of that program where they hired one for the Court of Appeal and one for the Supreme Court. In the second year, they hired 3 in each court. Now there's maybe 15 in each court, but it was a new program then. And she did it, and she said to me, "Paul, you should do this." And I said, "No, I'm too old. I want to get into the courtroom as a lawyer." But she said, "Paul, this will be a great experience. And when you sit there and work with the judge and help her or him, you learn what they need, to make a decision." And eventually I said, okay, she talked me into it. And I went down and got interviewed by this judge in that beautiful old courthouse that's not a courthouse anymore, on Georgia Street in Vancouver. Went into this beautiful, huge office with 30-foot high windows and a desk the size of a pool table, and this guy sitting on the other side. And I thought, oh my God, this is awful. Within 10 minutes of talking to him, I realized, wow, this could be really good. And I think he liked me as I was a bit of a different law student. I had had all these other previous experiences, and he thought that I would look at a case that was before him in a different way because of those previous experiences. And we clicked. And so, much to my surprise, I decided to put off my career another year. And I did that. And I say that was career changing for me because I really did learn about what a judge needs from a lawyer when he's in a courtroom in a way that I didn't learn that in law school. I learned about the law and what the law was and said and did, but I didn't learn about it from the perspective of a judge. And I did learn that in that year clerking for that judge. And we became very close. friends. And it was only after that I then had to go an article. But there was an arrangement because I'd clerked for a year. My articles were shorter. I think they were 8 months instead of a year or something. I lucked out with the judge that I articled to. He was wonderful. By the way, we were across the street from William Deverell, who lives here on Pender Island, who is an author.
Oh, yeah.
And he was a wonderful lawyer and a good friend of the lawyer I articled for, and that was when I first met. So I've known William Deverell since the year I article, which is about 1975 or something. And when we see each other now, we talk about what Gastown was like in the 70s. So that was a real incredible learning experience for me, but I met a lot of judges. And I ended up doing work, as I said later, when one of them would get called to do a commission of inquiry, they would call me to be the guy who pulled together the evidence and helped them write it. And that was an amazing experience for me. And I think it was because of all that work did that I eventually ended up on the court, I think. I can't be sure, but, that's what I think.
Okay, so for myself and for people listening, if it's okay for you to give a bit of an explanation as to what clerking is specifically and articling as well, too.
Yeah. Well, when you're clerking, you are assigned to a particular judge, and he says to you, okay, next week I'm hearing a case about this, and here's the material that's been filed. I want you to read it, and then we'll talk about it. So I would read it, and I would go into his office. By the way, his office was called his chambers. I would go into his chambers, and we would discuss what we'd read. And then when the evidence was being called in the courtroom, I would sit in the courtroom in the audience. And at the end of the day or at lunch hour in the breaks, I would go into his chambers, and he would say, Paul, you heard it when he said this, or you heard it when she, mentioned this case. And some case in the Supreme Court of Canada, I want you to go and read that and tell me, does it fit? Does it say what she said? And I would go through all that with him. So I would begin to learn about how he would judge what was coming before him and decide which way he should go. So that it was assisting him. It's the way I looked at it, the way he looked at it. But as I got halfway through the year, I realized I was learning. It was a wonderful learning experience for me because what I was learning? I was learning what a judge needs to hear to be able to make a decision.
Yeah. Okay. So interesting. So could you put that into a definition of like what does a judge need to hear to make a decision?
A judge needs to hear about previous cases that really relate closely to the one she or he is deciding.
Mm-hmm.
They need to, when they're hearing the evidence about this happened, about anything else around that influenced that. So when we say, why did Alice do this? We hear what she did, but it's harder to figure out why she did it or what influenced her to do that. And all of that goes into the judge deciding whether she was right or wrong to do that, or whether she did it and she shouldn't have done it, but it's the wrongness of it is sort of mellowed or ameliorated because of this circumstance, So you begin to look for those things to explain to you what really happened and why a person acted the way they did. And you help the judge do that because she or he will say to you, Paul, did you hear that? Yeah, I heard that. Well, go and look at this, or go and look at this, or, can you find another case where that has been dealt with? That sort of thing. So you would research the law for them.
Okay. Was this a pretty time-consuming job?
Yes.
Yeah.
Could be. Sometimes it was very time-consuming. Sometimes it wasn't. If it was a simple, straightforward case, it wasn't. But sometimes it was a complicated case. You'd wind up, they'd say, can you research this? It might take you several hours. You'd work nights and weekends. But you always knew you were learning. You were learning something special that the ordinary law student wouldn't learn.
Yeah. So that's clerking. And what is articling?
Articling is when you are assigned to a lawyer and you work with that lawyer, usually for a year. I say in my case, it was a shorter period. And what you do is you assist that lawyer and you follow her or him around, and they're in court on this day, or they're writing a contract this day, or they're doing that this day, and you work with them doing that. So you learn how to do all those practical things that a lawyer does every day. And then at the end of that year, you write what's called a bar exam. And there'll be a number of the questions about all of these things, and you answer them. And if you pass that exam, you then are called to the bar and you officially become a lawyer, which allows you to practice law.
Okay. How difficult is the bar exam? How challenging is it?
I didn't think the bar exam was very difficult, but then having spent a year as a law clerk and then almost a year as an article student, and both of the people to whom I was assigned, the judge and the lawyer, were wonderful people. I learned a lot, and I wanted to learn a lot. So, yeah, the bar exams, they were difficult, but they weren't horrendous.
So you passed the bar exam.
I did.
And you then what happens next?
Then I was called to the bar, and so I had all during this time period been close in touch with two of my law student colleagues who went through law school at the same time as I did. They were both younger than I, of course, but one of them had a graduate degree. The one that had the graduate degree came second in our class. Very, very bright guy. The other one, a woman, she was in the top quartile, as we called it, of the class, as was I. And we all decided we wanted to start our own law firm. So she was called to the bar first because one of the guys took off for the summer and started his articles 4 months later. So when I was called to the bar, the two of us had been called, and we set up our own law firm. And the third guy, the really bright one who'd come second in law school, he jokes about it. He became our receptionist and our secretary for the first 4 months. And then he was called to the bar. And so then we had this 3-person law firm.
What was it called?
It was called Prowse, Williamson, and Foster.
Oh, that sounds like a good law firm right there.
It was. PWF.
Did you guys specialize in anything?
Well, we were barristers. We spent most of our time in court. We did some contract work. We did a little bit of family law, but not much. But mostly we did criminal work. Okay.
So you have spent a significant amount of time getting to this point. How did it feel to open up a law firm and be a practicing lawyer?
It felt like it was hard to make much money. When we started, we did mostly legal aid. So we would do provincial court trials for which we got paid a minimal amount, but it was enough. And then we started to be assigned as what was called duty counsel. And then we would get paid by the government, and we would go to court every morning, and we would represent all the people who had been arrested the night before and didn't have a lawyer. And they were in the jail cells, and we would go around and interview them. And then when the case was called at 10 o'clock, we'd be in court. And when one of those was called, we'd stand up and, the Crown would say certain things. We'd use that would be a bail hearing. So that was learning the real nitty gritty. And then eventually we started doing trials, First, we started with fairly minor trials, but we ended up doing, within 3 years, we were doing pretty serious trials, murder trials, bank robberies, major trials.
So the initial first 3 years, the difficulty in attracting clients, I guess, is like starting a new business of any kind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you got to get your name up there, throw some business cards around. People got to know who you are. But when you started to do trials, these are longer situations that you're involved in. How did you enjoy that?
Oh, we really liked it because we felt we were getting there. And usually, if it was a significant trial at all, always 2 of the 3 of us would do it together. So we would have 2 counsel. We would help one another on that. And we got to know the judges in provincial court. The lawyer to whom I had articled, our offices were sublet space from him right on Alexander Street in Gastown. So we were just a couple of blocks from the provincial court. And he had been friends for years with a number of the provincial court judges. And every Friday, they would come down to his office and they would all sit around and have a couple of beer and talk about things. And we would be included in that. So we got to know those judges socially too. And so they became very friendly to us and accepting of us, and they never got angry with us or put us down or anything. They listened to us mostly. A couple of them weren't all that good, but most of them were. And that helped, that we got known in that circle.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear, right? Like the human experience of knowing somebody versus not knowing somebody.
Yeah,
so even
exactly,
in
exactly.
the legal system, that plays itself out as well, too, between judges and lawyers.
Yeah. And this was a small part of the legal profession. This was the small part that did the criminal law work in provincial court. We did a few Supreme Court trials, but not too many.
And so how many years were you practicing law for?
Well, after about 7 or 8, before that, after about 5 years, one of my two partners left to teach law at UVic. He's the one that had a graduate degree before he went to law school. And he became a very, very successful, known legal academic. He is one of the authorities, as I said, on Indigenous law in Canada. He's now retired, of course. And the other partner, she left to join a major law firm uptown. So that left me as a sole practitioner. So a guy that was the head of a boutique law firm that did major litigation, big cases, he had a very small firm, and he had taught me in law school. And when he found out that my two partners had gone off and I was on my own, he said, "Paul, I'd like you to join my law firm." And his law firm was then about 4 people. So I went up and I talked to him, and I didn't want to. As you know, I said I didn't want someone bossing me. I didn't want to be the junior guy in a law firm. I said, but what I'll do is I'll agree to you to join your firm as an associate counsel, but I won't be a member of your firm, but I'll be in your office. I'll be on your letterhead. It'll say Paul Williamson, associate counsel, and I will work with you on all sorts of cases, but I'll be free to do my own thing as well. He said, sure. And what I remember about it is he got out a piece of paper. We were having lunch. He wrote out an agreement. We both signed it. And I was with them 10 or 11 years, and we never had a single dispute.
Wow.
It was a wonderful 11 years. And because of my connection from being a clerk with the judicial community, I started being commissioned counsel on a number of cases that would take me away. I can remember going into northern BC for 6 weeks. The law firm that he had completely accepted that, and that law firm grew and grew and grew, and it was eventually about 12 people. And they were all wonderful lawyers. And incidentally, a majority of the law firm were women, which was unusual in that day, and I really liked that. And I'm still friends with all of them. So that I was very lucky. I started my career off with these two close friends, but with a lawyer that I had articled to, who I really admired and who had close connections in the criminal law world. And then I moved up to this other firm that operated in a different world of major, big litigation before the Supreme Court with a wonderful group of lawyers. So I was very lucky in my career.
It just occurred to me the question of what did it feel like to go into court and litigate? Was it something that you got excited by? Was it nerve-wracking? It depended on the case?
I got inspired by it rather than excited by it. I mean, if I had an interesting case and I look at it and I would think, wait a minute, the way to deal with this case is from this angle. And I would think about problems that judges had faced when I was clerking and how they got me to help them research this different angle. And then working with senior lawyers, like the lawyer that I articled for, who was such a good lawyer, and seeing how he had thought about it and approached it. And I loved it when I got a case. And of course, I discussed it with my colleagues in my law firm. And we would say, the way to deal with this is to go at it from this angle, which the other lawyers representing the other people haven't seen that. And this will work, And it was wonderful to do that and to see you would put that before the judge and the judge you could see them going, oh, yeah, and I found that really rewarding. And I was lucky that I was always surrounded by very, very good people that we would work together to come up with the critical argument to make.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that there's a intersection between law and creativity?
Well, creativity, that's yeah.
Because what you were describing to me, so like, let me know if I'm getting this wrong, but you're describing a lot of conversations that are coming up with creative ways of addressing a situation to persuade a judge. But is there an intersection? Am I getting this wrong? Is there an intersection between law and creativity, or not really?
Creativity, but the creativity is limited by two things: by the facts of the case and by the relative law. But the key is to look at those two things and find how the law will work to help you dealing with the facts that you have to deal with. And I guess you can be creative about that. I mean, you can make an argument that people haven't made before, and sometimes that really works. But you're better off if you can see, oh, somebody said something in another case that just fits this exactly. My favorite one of that in my career as a judge, when I was asked to decide whether a skinny dipping club in Surrey could rent the pool that was owned by the city of Surrey, a public pool. And I remember the student who was my clerk looking up cases, and she found this wonderful case in Quebec, in Ontario in 1915 or something, where a judge said they were appalled by what they thought was happening, but shocked by what they didn't know. And that was exactly what was going on here. People were opposed to skinny dipping because in their heads there were all sorts of things they thought they were happening that weren't happening. And that sort of, when you find something like that and you find a quote like that just fits perfectly, you just feel so good and you can throw it out there,
I never knew this before this conversation. So your clerk, when you're a judge, like really plays a key role. It's not just what is being spoken about in court, but it's also what a clerk can discover about a particular situation that could wind up swaying a decision.
Of course, because you research the law, and the lawyers will cite cases that they say apply. And one will say this one applies and one will say this one applies, and they lead to opposite results. And then you will think, and you will say to your law clerk, can you find me is there a Supreme Court of Canada case that deals with this issue? Or is there an appeal case in a Canadian province that deals with this issue? And when you're a clerk to a judge, you research that and you get good at finding those cases. That's what you do.
This is interesting because, my understanding of law is really minimal, and maybe other people's is as well too. I don't know. But when I see movies or TV shows, it just sort of seems as if, you've got like the prosecution, you got the defense, both sides are making their cases, and then the judge has to decide based on that. But it's not just that.
It's on the law. And if you find a case that suddenly fits here, that none of them talked about it, you recall them and you say, I'd like you to look at this case because it seems to me, and I want to hear what you have to say about that. So you don't do anything behind their back. If you're going to rely on something they haven't talked to you about, you give them the opportunity. Because the law, a judge has to be open in what she or he is doing and deciding. You don't do anything behind people's backs. It's all open court.
Okay. So I can't help myself. Quick side question. Favorite law-based TV show or movie that you've seen in your life?
That's a really tough one.
You can have a top three if you want. You can. It doesn't have to be a single one.
I just saw trying to think of the title of it, a movie I saw in the last year that a Pender Island resident who was a former prosecutor who appeared before me as a prosecutor said, Paul, you got to see this case. It's something about the fall. It's about a fall.
Oh, Anatomy of a Fall.
Anatomy of a Fall.
Yeah.
That's been my favorite movie. And it's interesting because I've watched the movie with a couple of people who are experienced in one way or another in courtrooms. And at the end of it, we said, is she guilty or innocent? And we came to different conclusions.
Yeah. Well, the movie sets it up that way.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, I'm glad you remembered the name of it, because one thing about being an octogenarian is my memory is failing me.
That's okay. So Anatomy of a Fall. I actually loved that movie. I thought it was great.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. Okay, getting back to your life and career here. So you said, if my memory is correct, 11 years working with the boutique law firm.
Yeah.
And it was a great experience. And it was all done on the back of a napkin.
I'm still in touch with a number of the lawyers in that firm, and particularly the guy that brought me into the firm.
Okay.
He was even older than I.
And so what happened after those 11 years?
Well, after those 11 years, one day I got a phone call from Ottawa, and it was a person that said, will you be in your office tomorrow morning between 10 and 11 o'clock Vancouver time? And I said, yeah, why? And she said, well, the Minister of Justice is going to phone you. I said, oh. So I was in my office the next morning, and at 10:30, I got a call from the Minister of Justice who said, would you accept an appointment to the Supreme Court? I hesitated, of course, but I didn't have any trouble saying yes. But let me tell you that after I said yes, and I got, and it was said in about a month I would be appointed to the court, and there would be a ceremony where I would be appointed. In that month, I remember lying in bed in the morning thinking, oh, God, what have I done? Am I really up to this? Can I really do this? I went through a nervous, self-questioning stage, but I went through with it, and didn't take me long to get accustomed to it and to begin to relax about it. And then eventually, most of the time, to really enjoy it. I mean, some of the times you don't because you're listening to awful things. But then I often listen to awful things as a lawyer, too. So that was part of my life as a lawyer, and it became part of my life as a judge.
Okay. All right. We're going to dig into this. But before we do, just for myself and for people listening, could you describe what the Supreme Court is, I guess, in detail for us? The
Supreme Court of British Columbia is the senior trial court. So there's also a provincial court, which hears minor cases. And there are a number of cases where the accused person can elect to simply be tried in provincial court, or they can elect to be tried in Supreme Court. They can decide. If they're going to do a jury trial, if they want a jury trial, it has to be in Supreme Court. And there are only certain very minor crimes, of course, can't be tried by a jury, but more serious crimes can be tried. So the Supreme Court of BC is the court that hears the more serious criminal cases, and it's the senior trial court. So there are no trials in any. The only higher court in BC is the Court of Appeal, and it just sits and decides whether the Supreme Court or the provincial court has done something right or has made a mistake. But they don't hear any trials themselves. So the Supreme Court is the senior trial court in British Columbia, and there's one in each province.
You get the request to be appointed, is that the correct term?
Yeah.
To the Supreme Court, and you said one of the things you thought of is that you'd be listening to horrible things. Is that because the Supreme Courts wind up hearing a lot of, I guess, intense cases, or? Well,
you hear nasty cases, you hear murder cases, you hear rape cases, you hear kidnapping cases. But you also hear a lot of fascinating cases. You hear cases about shipwrecks, or you hear cases about contractual arguments between two big companies. A lot of really interesting stuff. So it wasn't always awful. And murders can be awful, but they can be fascinating, trying to figure out why a person would do that, you know.
Okay, so how did your life change going from becoming a lawyer to being a Supreme Court judge of British Columbia?
It changed because I was making decisions instead of trying to get someone else to make a decision. That was the main thing. It changed because I had that responsibility. I had a heavy responsibility as a lawyer to put my client's case position forward in the best way that I could. But at the end of the day, I didn't have to decide. And as a judge, that was what I had to do.
That sounds like a pretty big responsibility.
Oh, it's a big responsibility. Of course it is, yeah.
Yeah. So just by what you're describing, they sound like two very different things, you know, persuading somebody to make a decision or being the person who's making a decision.
Yeah.
In terms of being a Supreme Court judge, do you have a group of judges working together on a case, or is it just a singular judge?
No, it's always a singular judge. In the higher court, the Court of Appeal, that doesn't hear any trials, there's always at least 3 judges sitting together on a case to decide whether the trial court made a mistake or didn't make a mistake. But in a trial court, there's always only one judge, so you're always on your own. Now, that doesn't mean that in the judge's coffee bar in the courthouse, you know, you'll go down and you've got some problem that's really got you, you're really struggling with it. You'll talk to a couple of your colleagues and say, gee, I'm trying to deal with this problem. And, you know, that's often quite, because one of them will say, well, I had to deal with that in a case, 5 years ago, and this is the name of the case, and you can look it up. Or, the Supreme Court of Ontario dealt with that problem. Or they'll say, well, what I would do in this is I would go down this road and look at this and look at this. So you would do that. And then you would go back into court and you would say to counsel, thinking about this, it's occurred to me that, and you would make sure they knew what you were thinking and where you were going. And so that they, in their turn, could respond to what you were saying and thinking.
Just like a side thought here as well, too, it sounds as if that there's this really interesting built-in relationship between judges and lawyers, that there has to be very good communication between the two. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, there are some lawyers who never are able to achieve that. And there are some judges, although it's more rare, who have difficulty with that. You usually wouldn't get appointed to the court unless you were open to those sorts of things. But yes, it's a community. And if you don't help one another with the specific matter before you, you help one another in the way you approach things generally as a judge, or the way you approach things generally as a lawyer. It's a community.
It's interesting. Communities have kind of unwritten rules, whereas there's a lot of written rules in law, obviously, right? Are there any sort of unwritten rules that exist within the legal profession?
Most rules are written in the legal profession. I mean, there are unwritten rules. It doesn't say you have to be polite, but you should be polite because it's helpful. The sort of standards of behavior are unwritten, but they're clearly understood. And of course, when you first appear in a court as a lawyer in your first while, I mean, you're like anyone, you're sort of in awe of, you're looking at this historic system and institution, and you treat it with respect. And that's not written in some law, but I mean, you do, and you learn that, and you work with your colleagues, and you watch other senior lawyers that you know are successful lawyers, and you see how they are, and you learn from them.
Well, thank you for explaining that. That makes a lot of sense, for sure. So when you had your time as being a Supreme Court judge, what were some of the cases that you were involved in that sort of, you have memories of, whether they be fond or not necessarily, but I guess cases that really still stand out in your mind to this day?
Well, I guess there are a number of cases that I sort of remember. There are a number of cases I've forgotten. Over the 19 years, I heard hundreds and hundreds of cases. I guess the most significant case that sticks out in my mind is the Nisga'a Treaty case, and because I think it's been the most influential of all the decisions that I made. And the submissions in that case were fascinating. They were superb lawyers on it. It's a case that I read about now. I just this past week read a case about treaty negotiations in British Columbia, and that was the first modern treaty that was negotiated that recognized that some right of Indigenous people to govern themselves survived Confederation. And that became a very important thing. And since that time, there have been 3 or 4 treaties negotiated which recognize a certain degree of self-government for some Indigenous groups. And so that was a fascinating case to hear and to listen to and to write. And I look back on that as, gee, I did something significant, you know. It's the one case. It was appealed, but eventually the appeal was dropped. And I just read a book in which the author writing about treaty negotiations in BC, and she said, you know, if that case had gone the other way and had said no, with the passage of the BNA Act, all governing powers went to either the province or the federal government, everything would have been different. But since it was said in that case that Indigenous right to self-government was diminished but not eliminated, then there's been this room for treaties. And I feel really good about that because I think that's right, or I wouldn't have decided it.
If it's okay, if you could give a little more detail and I guess like a little history of the Nisga'a Treaty for people listening.
Well, the Nisga'a are an Indigenous group in northwestern coastal BC. They had tried for years and years. They had sent delegations to Victoria to try and get a treaty that would give them some right to govern themselves in some respects. They said, this is our land. We were here before you got here. What gives you the right to govern us? The reality is you do, and we want a right to make self-government for ourselves and be able to govern as many aspects of our existence as we possibly can. And eventually, the federal government got into treaty negotiations with the Nisga'a, but the provincial government refused to be involved. They took the position that all powers to govern are either federal or provincial. There's nothing left for Indigenous people. But eventually, the province came on side. And I'm trying to think when that would have been. I guess it would have been probably in the late 70s or 80s, somewhere in there, maybe early 90s, 80s, I suppose. And so they eventually did negotiate a treaty. It took them a long time to do it. But then when they negotiated the treaty and it gave certain powers to the Nisga'a people to rule in a number of areas for themselves, things that for the rest of us would be either ruled by the federal government or the provincial government, not everything, but a number of areas. So their powers were diminished but not excluded or not taken away, which was the position I took in that case. The leader of the opposition in British Columbia and 2 of his fellow members of the Legislative Assembly brought an action before the court to have parts of the Nisga'a Treaty set aside, and they were the self-governing parts, generally speaking. I'm being simplistic here, but generally speaking. So that was the case that came before me. So the Nisga'a and the federal government opposed them and said, no, what we have done is right. And while the powers of Indigenous peoples were diminished with Confederation, they were not totally excluded. The Indigenous people were never parties to the agreement which ended up in Confederation in 1867. They weren't at the table. They were just left out. So anyway, I was asked by this leader of the opposition and his other two guys, to set aside parts of the treaty. And I had very good counsel, I have to say, on it. And I had a super court clerk who helped me. And actually, one of the other judges sent me his court clerk because she was a person very interested in it. So I had the two of them helping me and researching it and everything. And I wrote a lengthy decision in which I concluded that with Confederation in 1867, not all of the powers have been taken away from Indigenous peoples. And that what we had to do in treaties was to define those and decide which powers they still had, but they still had some powers. And so I upheld what had been done in the Nisga'a Treaty and upheld the treaty. And as I said, it was appealed, but eventually the appeal was dropped. And it's never been appealed. And so it has led now to a number of other treaties where Indigenous peoples have listed, and it's been agreed that they can self-govern in this area, and this area, and this area.
How long into your career as a judge did this take place?
I'd been a judge about 6 years.
I would assume that there was a significant amount of media attention on this issue.
Yes, there was.
Yeah. How was that experience? Was this in terms of it being something that had a lot of media focus and seemed as if it was going to be pretty controversial?
Oh, I knew it was. But I didn't let that affect what I decided. And I knew that, I wouldn't be involved in the media skirmishes afterwards. I remember the day the judgment was released, my friend that was teaching at UVic that had been my law partner, he said to me, Paul, can you get a copy of that judgment to me the morning you release it? He's in Victoria. And I said, well, I think I can. And he said, well, look, a friend of mine is coming over on the morning ferry, and you know her. And if she comes up to the courthouse, can you get them to give her a copy of it? And I'll have it 2 hours later in Victoria, and I'll have a press conference. But he didn't know what I was going to say.
Wow.
So we laughed about that. And I said, well, what if you don't like it? He said, I'll say so. And so that's what happened. She took the judgment to Victoria, and he gave a press conference at noon that day. It turned out he agreed with what I'd said. And of course, there was a huge press coverage. It was covered in the Globe and Mail in Toronto. I mean, it was a major decision.
I can't help but pick up on the fact that there's a sense of, I don't know if pride would be the right word, that it seems that you have about the decision and everything that happened. Because I'm in agreement with you for sure, right?
Yeah.
And definitely. But it seems as if it really meant something to you. And just a brief thing is that I did some interviews recently with First Nations elders. It was my first experience of having direct interactions with those individuals. And it was really impactful, actually. I found it really deeply impactful sitting in a room, making eye contact, and being open to hearing people's stories about what their life experiences were. And it really shifted how I perceived things and really informed me quite a lot as to just the level of injustice that First Nations have suffered in our country.
I always think about it when I think about what's going on today. And there's this fuss in the United States especially, but even in Canada, about cutting down on immigration. Well, wait a minute. We're all the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of immigrants. The Indigenous people were here for hundreds of years, and we just came in. And then we said, well, it's ours, and we'll put you in reserves. Come on.
Yeah, totally. And so their ability to self-govern themselves, what did that look like exactly? What were the results of that?
Well, the results of that, in the Nisga'a case, but in the case of a number of Native groups, is that they've set up governing bodies, and they make rules in the areas that the court said they could make rules. And I mean, they have a whole different attitude towards land ownership. we have this thing called a fee simple. We buy a piece of property and that's ours. I had my 4th birthday in Bella Bella, and I've always had a sort of connection with the Bella 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 Kula peoples. And it fascinates me that they all just lived along riverbanks, and the salmon run was what fed them. And if in one river the salmon ones were slow, they would move up the coast 50 miles to the next river. They didn't say they owned that land individually. The whole land was owned by the community and by all of them. It's a very different attitude, very different approach to ownership than we had. And we just imposed all our system on them, And that just fascinates me. What if some group came along and just said to us, no, you don't own this property. This belongs to, the president of Mars or something,
I think we'd be pretty upset.
Yes.
I think we'd be outraged. I think we'd be angry for a long time.
So there you are.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining all that. And any other cases that you were involved in that really left an impact with you?
Well, I mean, a lot of cases that I dealt with had just catastrophic effect on people's lives. I remember a case where a woman was just violently abused by her partner. I think they were actually married. And she eventually lashed out and killed him. But that wasn't like a planned murder where you set out to go and kill somebody because you were having an argument. This was a violent response to something that was happening to you. And like that case was hard fought. The Crown prosecutor said she killed her husband, she's guilty of murder. And the defense said, wait a minute. There's this history of violence, of how she was treated. We can understand why she finally lashed out the way she did. And so those are tough cases. And, the law tended to say, yeah, she was guilty of murder, but what do you do with that? And cases like that were hard to decide.
Yeah, I would certainly think so.
You've got some leeway. I mean, you can send a person to jail for 5 years or for life, So, but sending a person to jail is pretty awful. It's never a thing I like to do.
Yeah. Well, could you tell me more about that? Because I don't actually, you see this on TV, right? Or I see this on TV. And when you say it's hard sending people to jail, because do you feel that emotionally?
Well, what you feel is that, there are criminal gangs that are horrible people that plot ways to screw people and take things from them and all that, and they're a little easier. But a lot of other crimes, there's explanations why a person suddenly behaved the way they did, and it's a very human response to something, and those are the tough ones. And I've never been a fan of jail. It's not a great place. There isn't much rehabilitation happens in a jail. Most people just tough it out, So it doesn't make a kind of a positive contribution to society. If a person's a real threat, I can understand it. And occasionally you're with people who are a serial killer and who pack guns and, do things. But there's not a lot of people like that. But I can understand there are some circumstances where you say, yeah, we're going to lock this person up. But most people, they haven't done a lot of bad things. They've done something terrible, and there's some explanation for why they've done it, but it's still something that the law requires you to put them in jail. And that's not going to help them. And it's only going to help us minimally, So, I've never been comfortable with jail.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds like kind of an interesting burden to bear that I've never really considered before, actually. You mentioned when we first started the idea of people having a dim view of politicians, right? And that I think that we kind of look at lawyers a particular way, have really narrow perception of what a lawyer is. And that probably also figures into judges as well, too. But yeah, it seems as if it's a from what you're describing, a bit of a burden to bear to make the decision, the ruling to take someone's freedom away for X period of time, right?
I think I told you that when I was a lawyer, I acted as commission counsel on some inquiries, and I got started on that. The lawyer that I articled for did that, and he did a couple of major inquiries that I was his assistant commissioner, commission counsel. And I remember one where there was a hostage taking in the BC pen, and 4 prisoners grabbed 4 guards, one of whom was a woman, and they took them in with them. And they had someone coming to the guard to pick them up. And the thing was, they were to release them to go to get in that car, and they would release these people that they'd taken prisoner when they'd got a certain distance away. And this went on for 3 or 4 days. And, there were all kinds of guards and police and everything surrounding this room where these 4 people were. And eventually something happened, and one of the guards thought one of these guys was coming at him, and he shot him, but he missed him, and he hit the prison guard who was taken hostage, who was a woman, and she was killed. And there was a big commission study about what went wrong there and what happened, and that was quite an experience. But I'll tell you one thing I remember about it that sort of made me think about what jails are like. There was a wonderful guy that worked in the jail there that took the commission counsel and me on a tour of everything in the jail. He wanted us to know what. This was the BC pen, which doesn't exist anymore. A horrible place with cells all over everywhere. But there was a place where they put guys in security if they'd done something wrong. And these were little cells that were completely blocked off. They were just 4 walls and a bunk and a toilet. And there was a little window which you opened, and they'd pass food in to them. But these guys were completely isolated, and they'd be put in there for, for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks if they'd done something wrong. And one of the things I noticed when we were going down this row where there are about 6 of these little cells is that there was like a camera, it looked like a TV camera there, as if it was filming everything. And I said, well, why do they have that here in this corridor? And the guy said, oh, well, because sometimes the prison guards will come up and they'll open the window and they'll say, here's your lunch. And they'll be passing it through the window and they'll go, oops. And it fell on the floor outside, and the guy didn't get to eat.
Oh, my gosh.
And I'll never forget that. It was a prison official that told us that story. And it just made me think prisons are places where we don't know what happens. The public doesn't really know what goes on. So we have to be very careful about using that sanction. Now, let me tell you, in my 19 years as a judge, many, many times I sentenced people to prison, but I never liked it. I never liked doing it.
So when your 19 years came to an end, how did that look? What made you decide to retire?
It was the opposite of when my 19 years started. I remember I told you that after I was told I was going to be appointed in 3 weeks, and I spent that 3 weeks going, oh my God, can I really do this? And how worried and nervous I was. When I retired, I thought, oh my God, because let me tell you, being a judge, you work long hours.
How many hours?
Oh, you're in court all day. And you usually sit about 3 weeks and you get a week off, if your trial finishes, to write your judgment. But you're writing. So I would write nights and I would write weekends, and I would get up really early. I would be at work at 7:30 or 8 every morning, and court started at 10. So that would give me a couple of hours to read and write. Court would end at 4, and I'd spend a couple of hours reading or writing. And sometimes I'd go back, I'd take stuff home and work in the evening. So you work very long hours. And I thought, God, I'd already bought property on Pender where I would spend my holidays. But I thought, how can I suddenly exist going from this really long hours working to not working? And then I thought, well, I'll make myself available to take on a couple of things. I'll do some inquiries or something. And The first 2 years, I did a little bit of that work, but I soon found I didn't want to. I'd had it. I was too old. I'd been working since I started at age 17 when I got out of high school, and all through university, I taught, When I was in law school, I taught at Capilano College. Talk about working long hours. So from age 17 until I retired at age 72, I should have been ready for it. But it took me a couple of years to settle into it, but now I love it. I just love it. And I love living on Pender Island.
Well, what is it specifically you love about retirement? The extra time? What are you doing with your time?
Yes, of course, it's the time, and I read the things I want to read that my friends are reading instead of being buried in law books. I can travel. Catherine and I travel usually every September. We go to Europe, and I have a daughter in New Zealand, and every winter, or late winter, every February or March, I go to New Zealand, and I love New Zealand. So I just love this freedom to decide what I'm going to do next week. You remember I said I hated being bossed around. When I was a judge, the ACJ, the Assistant Chief Justice who assigned the cases, would say to me, Paul, you're going to go do a murder in Victoria next week, or you're going to go to Kelowna and do a trafficking trial. Off I went, did what I was told. When I retired, nobody tells me what to do except my children.
Okay. How many children do you have?
I have 3.
And you mentioned Catherine. I'm presuming that is your wife?
Yes.
Okay. How long have you been married for?
Since sometime in the last century.
Okay. That's a while.
And I still love her.
Fantastic. And when we spoke on the phone a little while ago, you mentioned a love for being on the water.
Yes. As a child, in my first 7 years, I lived a block from the water in West Vancouver. And in fact, for part of that, my dad came home from the war. I was born in 1940. When my dad came home from the war, so I was 5, we lived in what had been army huts in Ambleside Park. And at the end of the war, they made them available to soldiers coming home who had families, and where were they going to live? So there we were, right on Ambleside Beach, And when I was 4, my dad got posted to the air station in Bella Bella, and we lived on a house on pilings on the water. And I remember that. I'm 4 years old, and I remember whales going by and spouting up and just being on the water all the time. So all my life, other than 2 years in Ottawa, the year when I was working on getting the Canada Student Loan Bill passed, and then I went to Carleton and did an MA for a year, and I was 2 years teaching in Quebec. So those are 4 years when I was away from the ocean. But I'm about to turn 84, which means for 80 years I've been a stone's throw from the ocean. And I can't fathom not living close to the ocean.
Yeah, and you love being on boats in the ocean as well, too.
Yes, I sailed for many, many years, yeah. And after I bought this property on Pender Island, I sold my sailboat and bought a powerboat, which I kept in Ladner, and that's how I went back and forth between Pender and Ladner when I was still working, because I could do it in an hour and 15 minutes instead of the 3.5 hours involved in waiting for the ferry and getting on the ferry and the ferry being late.
Yeah, that must have been exhilarating as a commuting choice, for sure.
It was great. Oh. But when I got into my 80s, my wife and my doctor and my oldest daughter said to me, Paul, you've got to stop crossing the strait in a powerboat by yourself. All right, sold my boat.
I get people telling you what to do again.
There you go.
It just never stops in this world.
That's what happens when you get older. Get ready.
Well, we're going to wind this down, but yeah, I'll leave the last word for you here. Any last things you want to end off with?
I just want to say that I have been very lucky. I have worked very hard. I say to young people that I know that have an ounce of intelligence, work at it and create a life that you enjoy doing, that gives you some reward, that you feel good about it. And I say to parents of children, don't demand that your kid choose a career too early. I set foot in a lawyer when I was 36 years old, and it was the best thing I ever did, because by then I knew what I wanted to do. And if you take time to get some life experience before you settle into what's going to be your lifelong career, the odds of your being happy increase.
Oh, boy. Well, thank you so much to Paul for doing that interview. That one we recorded in August and took a little while to put that one out. But man, super pleasurable to get to sit down with Paul and have that interview with him. I really enjoyed that. So thank you very much for listening. I'd like to thank Ben McConkey for providing the theme music to this podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast and you'd want to learn more about other people, I got a ton of extra episodes in the back catalog to check out. A lot of fascinating people in there, a lot of interesting stories. If you'd like to share this podcast with other people, that would be appreciated. And thank you for sticking around to the end. I don't know how many people do, but you know that you did. So thanks for being here, and hopefully we'll see you next time.